The farmhouse had been sitting empty for 15 years when the family finally decided someone needed to do something with it. My grandfather had died when I was 12, and since then the old place had been slowly deteriorating, while my aunts and uncles argued about whether to sell it, rent it, or just let it fall down completely. I was the only one who seemed to care about preserving it. Maybe it was because I'd spent so many summers there as a kid, helping Grandpa with repairs and listening to his stories about the old days. The house held memories that the rest of the family seemed eager to forget, but I couldn't bear the thought of losing it to neglect or developers. When I turned 25 and finally had some savings, I made an offer to buy the property from the family estate. My relatives were happy to get it off their hands, even at below market value. They thought I was crazy for wanting to take on such a massive restoration project, but I saw potential where they saw problems. The house was a classic 1920s farmhouse with good bones but decades of deferred maintenance. The roof leaked, the plumbing was shot, and the electrical system was a fire hazard waiting to happen. But the foundation was solid, the hardwood floors were salvageable, and the craftsmanship in the original construction was something you couldn't find anymore. I quit my job in the city and moved into a trailer on the property, planning to spend the next 2 years bringing the house back to life. My plan was to start with the essential systems, roof, plumbing, electrical, then work my way through each room systematically. I thought I knew every inch of that house from my childhood visits, but I was about to discover that my grandfather had kept some secrets, even from the family members he trusted most. The first hint that something was hidden came when I started working in the basement. Chapter 2. The Basement Project. The basement had always been my grandfather's domain. As a kid, I'd been allowed down there only occasionally, usually to help him retrieve canned goods from the pantry shelves or to fetch tools from his workbench. It was a typical farmhouse basement: stone foundation walls, wooden floor joists overhead, and a collection of storage areas that had accumulated decades of family possessions. My plan was to waterproof the foundation, update the electrical panel, and create a proper workshop space. But first, I needed to clear out all the accumulated junk: boxes of old clothes, broken furniture, rusty farm equipment, and countless mason jars filled with things I couldn't identify. It was while moving a heavy wooden cabinet away from the east wall that I noticed something odd. The cabinet had been positioned in a way that seemed deliberately placed to hide a section of the wall behind it. When I finally got it moved, I could see that the stonework was different in that area. Newer mortar, slightly different colored stones, as if someone had filled in an opening at some point. I ran my hands along the wall, feeling for any irregularities. About 4 feet from the floor, I found what felt like the edge of a wooden frame hidden behind a thin layer of plaster and paint. Someone had walled up what appeared to be a doorway, then disguised it so well that you'd never notice it unless you were looking for it. The discovery sent a chill down my spine. Why would my grandfather wall up a door in his own basement? What was he trying to hide, and from whom? I spent the rest of that day carefully chipping away at the plaster, revealing more of the hidden door frame. It was definitely a doorway. I could see the hinges on one side and what looked like a heavy-duty lock mechanism on the other, but it had been sealed up so thoroughly that it would take serious effort to open it. That night, I lay in my trailer thinking about what I'd found, wondering what secrets my grandfather had kept hidden behind that wall. Chapter 3. Breaking Through. I spent the next morning gathering the tools I'd need to break through the sealed doorway. I started with a hammer and chisel, carefully removing the plaster and mortar that had been used to hide the door. The work was slow and dusty, but gradually the full outline of the entrance became visible. What I found was more elaborate than I'd expected. This wasn't just a simple door that had been walled over. It was a heavy wooden door with multiple locks and metal reinforcements. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to secure whatever was behind it, then gone to even more trouble to hide its existence entirely. The door itself was made of thick oak planks bound with iron straps, more like something you'd find on a medieval castle than in a farmhouse basement. There were 3 separate deadbolt locks, each requiring a different key, and the hinges were massive things that looked like they could support a bank vault door. I tried the door handle, not really expecting it to turn, but to my surprise, it moved freely. The door wasn't locked. It was just sealed shut by the mortar and plaster that had been applied around the frame. Someone had wanted to make sure this door could never be opened again, at least not without considerable effort. It took me another hour to clear away enough of the ceiling material to actually open the door. When I finally pulled it open, the hinges groaned in protest, and a rush of stale, cold air flowed out from the darkness beyond. I shined my flashlight into the opening and saw stone steps leading down into what appeared to be a much larger space than should have existed under the house. The air smelled musty and old, with an underlying odor I couldn't identify, but that made me vaguely uneasy. I called down into the darkness, and my voice echoed back from what sounded like a substantial underground room. This wasn't just a root cellar or storage space. This was something much more significant. Taking a deep breath, I started down the stone steps into my grandfather's secret. Chapter 4. The Hidden Room. The stone steps led down about 12 feet into a chamber that was much larger than I'd expected. My flashlight beam revealed a room that was roughly 20 feet square, with stone walls that looked much older than the house above. This wasn't something my grandfather had built. This was something that had been here long before the farmhouse was constructed. The ceiling was supported by thick wooden beams, and the floor was made of fitted stone that had been worn smooth by age. Along the walls were wooden shelves and cabinets, all empty now but clearly designed for long-term storage. In the center of the room was a heavy wooden table with what appeared to be maps spread across its surface, but it was the far wall that caught my attention. It was covered with photographs, documents, and what looked like newspaper clippings, all connected by red string in a pattern that reminded me of conspiracy theory boards I'd seen in movies. Someone had been using this room to investigate something, and they'd been very thorough about it. I moved closer to examine the wall of evidence. The photographs were black and white, dating from what looked like the 1940s and 1950s. They showed groups of men in suits, some standing in front of buildings I didn't recognize, others gathered around tables in what appeared to be meeting rooms. The newspaper clippings were yellowed with age, but I could make out headlines about missing persons, unexplained disappearances, and what appeared to be a series of articles about corruption in local government. Many of the articles had been highlighted and annotated in my grandfather's careful handwriting. The documents were even more intriguing. There were copies of official reports, correspondence between government agencies, and what appeared to be financial records, showing large sums of money changing hands. Everything was meticulously organized and cross-referenced, as if someone had been building a case for something. At the center of it all was a large map of the local area, marked with red X's at various locations. Some of the X's were labeled with dates, others with names I didn't recognize. It looked like the work of someone tracking a pattern of events across several decades. I realized I was looking at the product of years, maybe decades, of investigation into something my grandfather had considered important enough to hide from his own family. Chapter 5. The Investigation. I spent hours in that underground room, trying to piece together what my grandfather had been investigating. The more I studied the wall of evidence, the more disturbing the picture became. This wasn't just casual research. This was the work of someone who had stumbled onto something dangerous and had been trying to expose it. The newspaper clippings told a story of corruption and cover-ups, spanning several decades. Young people had been disappearing from the area since the 1940s, always under circumstances that seemed suspicious but were never properly investigated. The official explanations were always the same: runaways, accidents, people who had simply decided to start new lives elsewhere. But my grandfather's annotations told a different story. He'd identified patterns in the disappearances, connections between the victims, and links to powerful people in the community who seemed to benefit from keeping certain secrets buried. His handwriting filled the margins of every article, asking questions that the authorities had apparently never bothered to pursue. The photographs showed many of the same faces appearing at different events over the years. Men in expensive suits attending charity functions, political rallies, and business meetings. My grandfather had labeled many of them with names and titles: judges, police chiefs, business leaders, politicians, people who had the power to make problems disappear. The financial records were perhaps the most damning evidence. They showed large payments being made to various officials, always around the same time that investigations into missing persons cases were quietly dropped or transferred to other jurisdictions. Someone had been paying to keep secrets, and my grandfather had been tracking the money trail. But the most chilling discovery was a folder labeled Witnesses that contained photographs and biographical information about people who had tried to come forward with information about the disappearances. Many of the photos had red X's drawn across them, with dates that corresponded to when those people had either disappeared themselves or died in what were officially ruled accidents. My grandfather had been investigating a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of local government and law enforcement. And based on the evidence in this room, people had been killed to keep it secret. I was beginning to understand why he'd hidden this room so carefully. Chapter 6. The Personal Connection. As I continued studying the evidence, I began to notice names and faces that seemed familiar. Some of the photographs showed people I recognized from my childhood, family friends, local business owners, people my grandfather had seemed to trust and respect. Seeing them connected to this web of corruption and violence was deeply unsettling. But it was when I found the folder labeled Family that everything became personal. Inside were photographs of people I definitely recognized: my grandmother, my aunts and uncles, and even some pictures of myself as a child. But these weren't happy family photos. These were surveillance-style pictures, taken from a distance, as if someone had been watching our family. There were also documents that showed my grandfather had been receiving threats, letters warning him to stop asking questions, to mind his own business, to think about what might happen to his family if he continued his investigation. The threats were never signed, but they were specific enough to be terrifying. One letter, dated just 6 months before my grandfather's death, was particularly chilling. "Your grandsons are handsome boys. It would be a shame if something happened to them because their grandfather couldn't learn to keep his mouth shut." I realized that my grandfather's investigation hadn't just put him in danger, it had put our entire family at risk. And based on the dates on some of the documents, the threats had been escalating in the months before his death. My grandfather had died of what was officially ruled a heart attack, but now I was beginning to wonder if that was really what had happened. The timing was too convenient, coming just as his investigation seemed to be reaching some kind of conclusion. I found his final notes, written just days before his death. He'd discovered something significant, something he called the final piece of the puzzle. But before he could act on it, he was dead, and his investigation was buried with him. Except it wasn't buried. It was hidden in this secret room, waiting for someone to find it and continue the work he'd started. I was beginning to realize that my decision to restore the farmhouse had put me in the middle of something much more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. Chapter 7. The Current Threat. Among my grandfather's final notes, I found evidence that the conspiracy he'd been investigating was still active. The disappearances hadn't stopped with his death. They'd just become more careful, more spread out, harder to connect. But the pattern was still there for anyone who knew how to look for it. My grandfather had identified what he called the organization, a network of powerful people who had been operating in the shadows for decades. They weren't just covering up crimes, they were actively involved in human trafficking, using their positions of authority to protect their operations and eliminate anyone who got too close to the truth. The most recent documents in the room were dated just weeks before my grandfather's death. He'd discovered that the organization was planning to expand their operations, using new technology and connections to move their activities to a larger scale. He'd been preparing to take his evidence to federal authorities when he died. But what terrified me most was finding my own name in his final notes. My grandfather had been worried that the organization might target family members if they discovered his investigation. He'd made plans to protect us, including instructions for what to do if something happened to him. Those instructions led me to a hidden safe behind one of the stone walls. Inside, I found more evidence, including photographs and documents that were even more recent than the ones on the walls. Someone had been continuing the investigation after my grandfather's death, adding new information to his files. The handwriting on the newer documents wasn't my grandfather's. Someone else had been using this room. Someone who had access to the house even after it had been abandoned. Someone who was still tracking the organization's activities and adding to the evidence my grandfather had collected. I found a note addressed to whoever finds this room that explained everything. My grandfather had shared his investigation with one other person, a federal agent who had been working undercover to expose the organization. That agent had been using the hidden room as a base of operations for the past 15 years, continuing the investigation and waiting for the right moment to act. The note warned that my discovery of the room would likely be noticed by the organization's watchers. They'd been monitoring the property, waiting to see if anyone would find my grandfather's evidence. By opening that door, I'd probably triggered their attention. The final line of the note chilled me to the bone. If you're reading this, You're now part of the investigation whether you want to be or not. Trust no one in local law enforcement. Contact Agent Sarah Martinez at the number below. Your life may depend on it. Chapter 8. The Federal Agent. I called the number immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed. The phone rang twice before a woman's voice answered. Martinez, my name is David Thompson, I said. I think you knew my grandfather, Robert Thompson. I found your note in his hidden room. There was a long pause then. How did you get into that room? It was sealed. I'm renovating the house. I found the door behind a false wall and broke through the seal. Jesus, she muttered. How long ago? About 4 hours. Listen to me very carefully, Agent Martinez said, her voice urgent. You need to get out of that house right now. Don't pack anything. Don't call anyone. Just leave. Drive to the Walmart on Highway 9 and wait in the parking lot. I'll be there in 30 minutes. What's going on? What kind of danger am I in? The kind that got your grandfather killed, she said bluntly. They've been watching that property for 15 years, waiting for someone to find that room. By now they know you've been inside. You have maybe an hour before they decide you're a threat that needs to be eliminated. I looked around the underground room, suddenly feeling trapped. What about all this evidence? We can't just leave it. The evidence is already copied and stored in multiple secure locations, Martinez assured me. Your grandfather was paranoid, but he was also smart. Everything in that room has been documented and preserved. What matters now is keeping you alive long enough to testify when we finally move against them. I grabbed my grandfather's final notes and headed for the stairs. How long have you been investigating this? 18 years, she said. Your grandfather contacted the FBI in 2005 when he realized how big this thing was. I've been working undercover ever since, building cases against everyone involved. We're finally ready to move, but we need living witnesses to make the charges stick. I reached the main floor of the house and headed for the door, my heart pounding. Why didn't you contact me sooner? Why let me stumble into this? Because we didn't know if we could trust you, Martinez admitted. Your grandfather's investigation put your entire family at risk. We've been protecting you from a distance, but we couldn't bring you into the operation until we were sure you weren't compromised. I got into my truck and started driving toward the highway, constantly checking my mirrors for signs of pursuit. Compromised how? The organization has people everywhere. Police, judges, politicians, business leaders. Some of them are your neighbors, people you've known your whole life. We couldn't risk exposing our investigation until we were ready to take them all down at once. As I drove toward the meeting point, I realized that my simple plan to restore my grandfather's farmhouse had thrust me into the middle of a federal investigation that had been building for nearly 2 decades. The question now was whether I would live long enough to see justice finally served. Chapter 9. The Network Revealed. Agent Martinez was waiting in an unmarked sedan when I arrived at the Walmart parking lot. She was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and the kind of alert posture that suggested she was always ready for trouble. She motioned for me to get into her car, then immediately started driving toward the interstate. We're going to a safe house, she explained, as we merged into traffic. Somewhere they can't reach you while we finalize the operation. Tell me about this organization, I said. How big is it? How long has it been operating? Martinez glanced in her rearview mirror before answering. It started in the 1940s as a small group of local officials who were taking bribes to look the other way on certain crimes. But it evolved into something much worse. They discovered there was serious money in human trafficking, and they had the perfect setup. Control of law enforcement, the courts, and local government. She showed me a tablet with organizational charts that looked like something from a major corporation. Names, positions, connections, and financial flows were all mapped out in detail. I recognized many of the names from my grandfather's investigation, but there were dozens more I'd never seen before. They've been operating for over 70 years, Martinez continued, moving people, mostly young women and children, through a network that stretches across multiple states. Your grandfather stumbled onto them when he started investigating the disappearances in your area, but he quickly realized this was much bigger than just local crime. The scope of what she was describing was overwhelming. How many people are involved? In the core organization? About 40 people in positions of real power. But they have hundreds of associates, people who provide services or look the other way when needed, judges who dismiss cases, police who lose evidence, social workers who don't ask questions about missing kids. She pulled up photos on the tablet, showing surveillance footage of meetings, financial transactions, and what appeared to be human trafficking operations. The evidence was extensive and damning. Your grandfather's investigation was crucial because he documented the historical pattern, Martinez explained. He proved this wasn't just recent criminal activity. It was a decades-long conspiracy that had been protected by corruption at every level of government. Why haven't you arrested them already? Because we need to get them all at once, she said grimly. If we move against some of them, the others will disappear or eliminate evidence. We've been waiting for the right moment when we can take down the entire network simultaneously. And that moment is now? Martinez nodded. Your discovery of the room accelerated our timeline. They'll assume you've seen everything and will move to protect themselves. We have to act before they can destroy evidence or eliminate witnesses. As we drove toward the safe house, I realized that my grandfather's death had been just the beginning of this story, not the end. Chapter 10. The Final Operation. The safe house was a nondescript apartment in a city 2 hours away from the farm. Martinez explained that federal agents had been preparing for this operation for months, positioning resources and coordinating with multiple agencies to ensure they could move against the entire network simultaneously. Tomorrow morning at 6 a.m., we're executing search warrants at 47 locations across 3 states, she told me. We'll be arresting everyone from the top leadership down to the low-level associates. It's going to be the largest organized crime takedown in the region's history. She showed me the evidence they'd compiled. Thousands of documents, photographs, financial records, and witness statements that painted a picture of systematic corruption and criminal activity spanning multiple generations. My grandfather's investigation had provided the historical foundation, but the current evidence was even more damning. We have recordings of them planning murders, Martinez said. We have financial records showing millions of dollars in illegal transactions. We have testimony from victims who escaped and witnesses who were brave enough to come forward. This time, we have enough evidence to put them away forever. The organization had grown complacent over the years, believing they were untouchable because of their control over local law enforcement. They'd never suspected that federal agents had been infiltrating their operations and documenting their crimes. Your grandfather would be proud, Martinez told me. His investigation made all of this possible. He identified the key players, documented their methods, and provided the roadmap we needed to build our case. But she also warned me that the danger wasn't over. Even after we arrest the leadership, there will be associates who escape the net. Some of them will blame you for exposing the organization. You'll need protection for a while, at least until we're sure we've rounded up everyone involved. That night, I lay awake in the safe house thinking about my grandfather and the courage it must have taken to investigate such dangerous people. He'd risked everything to expose the truth, knowing that it might cost him his life. In the end, it probably had, but his sacrifice hadn't been in vain. Tomorrow, justice would finally be served for all the victims of the organization's crimes. The young people who had disappeared over the decades would finally have their stories told, and the people responsible would face the consequences of their actions. I thought about the farmhouse, sitting empty now, its secret finally revealed. When this was all over, I would finish the restoration, but it would be a different kind of memorial than I'd originally planned. Chapter 11. Justice Served. The operation began at dawn with coordinated raids across 3 states. I watched from the safe house as news reports showed federal agents arresting dozens of people, including several I recognized from my childhood. Judges, police chiefs, business leaders, and politicians were all led away in handcuffs as the full scope of the conspiracy was finally revealed to the public. The evidence seized during the raids was overwhelming. Financial records showed the organization had generated over $50 million through human trafficking operations over the past 2 decades alone. Computer files contained detailed records of victims, buyers, and transportation routes that stretched across the country. Most importantly, they found evidence of current operations that allowed them to rescue 17 people who were being held against their will. Seeing those victims reunited with their families made all the danger and fear of the past few days worthwhile. Agent Martinez called me that evening with an update. "We got all the major players," she said. "A few low-level associates are still at large, but the organization is finished. The leadership is facing federal charges that will put them away for life. The trials would take months, but the evidence was so extensive that convictions seemed certain. My grandfather's investigation had provided the historical context that proved this was a long-term criminal conspiracy, not just isolated incidents of corruption. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now you get to go home and finish restoring that farmhouse," Martinez said. "But first, there's something you need to see." She took me back to the farm the next day, but this time we weren't alone. A team of federal agents was carefully documenting everything in the hidden room, preserving my grandfather's investigation as evidence for the trials. But they'd also found something I'd missed. A letter my grandfather had written to me specifically, hidden in a place where only I would think to look. It was tucked inside the old family Bible that had always sat on his kitchen table. The letter explained everything: how he'd discovered the organization's activities, why he'd felt compelled to investigate despite the danger, and how proud he was that someone in the family would eventually continue his work. "I always hoped you'd be the one to find that room," he'd written. "You were the only one who really understood what this place meant to our family. I knew that if anyone would restore the house properly, it would be you. And I knew that if anyone would have the courage to see this through to the end, it would be you too." 6 months later, I finished the farmhouse restoration. The hidden room became a memorial to my grandfather's investigation and all the victims of the organization's crimes. Local schools bring students to learn about the importance of standing up to corruption and fighting for justice, even when it's dangerous. The farmhouse is beautiful now, filled with light and life again. But it's also a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought in secret by ordinary people who refuse to let evil triumph. My grandfather's courage saved countless lives and brought justice to victims who had been forgotten by everyone else. His legacy isn't just the restored farmhouse, it's the knowledge that one person's determination to do what's right can change everything. Thank you for listening to this story of courage, justice, and the power of never giving up on the truth. My grandfather's investigation reminds us that ordinary people can make an extraordinary difference when they're willing to stand up for what's right, even in the face of danger. The fight against human trafficking and corruption continues every day, carried out by brave individuals who work in the shadows to protect the vulnerable and expose those who abuse their power. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Please let me know what part of the world you're listening from, and share your thoughts about how we can better support the fight against human trafficking and corruption in our own communities. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing it with others. These stories matter because they remind us that justice is possible when good people refuse to stay silent. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most important discoveries are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to look for the truth.